until then, that I would like to join several of the other speakers who, upon starting their presentation, modified their title. What I would like to talk about today is not just my sort of corruption of Marguerite's Ceci n'est pas une pipe with Ceci n'est pas un titre. I would like to talk about why Ceci n'est pas just un titre, or in which way we can actually get information out of paratextual information such as titles. So I would like to talk now about paratext in printed music books from the early modern period, more concisely. And I would like to make some examples how the incorporation of paratext into databases creates valuable resources for both historiographical research and music analysis. Now, here would be an example to follow. I'm just going to carry on, and then we can retroactively sort of provide the visuals. So with paratext, I mean non-musical text in a musical source. It can be informative or decorative. It can involve titles and subtitles, letters of dedication, title pages, tables of content, laudatory poetry, and performance instructions, and other texts. Thank you so much. Right. So this would be the next. And now here we are. I think I'm going to navigate like this. Right, so these are all kind of examples of paratexts. So laudatory poetry, as they're at the back, or performance instructions. In short, with paratext, I mean here all the text in a printed musical collection that isn't musical notation, or that isn't the sung words of vocal parts. Generally, paratext is relatively straightforward to be entered into databases. Of course, there are natural problems, such as like problems of legibility or accuracy, but it shares that with other notations. But compared to musical text, it's generally much easier to transliterate. Already, pretty much all of the data in databases such as RISM consists of source paratext, apart from incipits maybe, or standardized titles, which are created newly. However, the title pages of printed publications, information about voice parts and about printers and publishers, all of these are paratexts. To incorporate further kinds of paratext in databases has great potential. Not only can it be of interest to researchers, but it can also facilitate the definition of work as it is introduced in RISM after this conference soon. A general and quite straightforward definition of work in the context of these early modern musical prints could be its representation on the table of contents. Here we have a table of contents from an Orfeo Vecchi print, and there, of course, some kind of a definition could just be what is listed on there. A mass, for example, is mentioned as one title, a motet also as one, however, a motet of two parts as sort of two connected parts. In the last years, I've been looking at the production of printed music books in Italy in the 16th and 17th century. More concisely, I composed a database of all sorts of paratext appearing in books of masses, or in other words, books that contain at least one polyphonic setting of the mass ordinary sections. To create this database, I used mainly existing data from the RISM series A1 and A2, the printed sacred music database by RISM Switzerland, and especially also the invaluable Catalogue of Mass, Office, and Holy Week music that is edited by Jeffrey Kurtzman and Anne Schnobelen and is online in the Journal of 17th Century Music Instrumenta series. Once I had this paratextual database together, I could create taxonomies of different forms of paratext, and I could parse each individual entry according to content, purposes, and information about compositions. And then, of course, the world of printed masses was my oyster. I could make now all sorts of quantitative statistical evaluations of specific phrases. I could examine editorial practices and also examine certain stylistic phenomena as they were represented in these non-musical texts. For example, a term like brevis in Missa Brevis, I could look for that and then see how this sort of correlates with other phenomena of compositional strategy or printed representation. Just to give you a rough impression of the size of my data set, This included information of just over 830 individual publications, of which about 150 were reprints. And together they contained about 1,360 individual mass settings. So this isn't big data, but it's a remarkable data set for any early modern music historian. In the next minute, I would like to show you one example of this methodology and focus on the titles of individual masses, because this is a paratext, a kind of paratext, that might most directly be relevant to how we define a musical work in early modern repertories. In terms of their titles, masses required more complex titles than other polyphonic genres. In motets or madrigals, for example, the title very often consisted of the text incipit, like here. However, in masses, you needed some extra information. And that's because the term mass was a generic one. It covered several individual texts that in the liturgy of the Catholic Mass are actually quite far apart. So this is just a brief overview of elements. So I had to somewhat taxonomize it in order to be able to parse individual entries of titles with these masses. This is a summary of general sort of phenomena that can also overlap and serve several of these purposes. So there are elements of general description, which we're going to start with, which would be, for example, of authorship, like it's a mass by Palestrina. It could be of numbering, like the first or second, of the mode, of text setting, and of if it's a specific compositional design, such as canons or solmization syllables. Oh, sorry, that's that. So these are all things that are relatively superficial elements of description in a title that can sort of have a primary purpose of being able to tell several settings apart in a collection. However, of course, they might also have additional purposes. Then the next one I would like to talk about would be additional information to allow a successful or appropriate performance. Here I would say something like occasional suitability, like Missa da Feria, meaning it's for a weekday performance, or Missa in Resurrectione Christi, which would be for Ascension Day. Easter Day, of course. It can be information about the vocal forces required, so the voice parts, for instance, about the vocal style, these are all sort of umbrella terms, about the vocal ranges, a voci pari or pieni, or also about the relationship of pitch and notation. This mainly is information, for example, whether it has to be transposed in performance. I'm going through these quite quickly because this is just an overview over what kind of elements we have, and then we look at one specific. Now, there's also some non-essential information for the purpose of performance. Here I would have, for example, background information about dedicatees or other honored people or location. For example, the Missa Borromea, or there are several of these by Milanese composers relating, of course, to Carlo Borromeo, or also to like specific places. And other, I would also say, sort of nicknames for these masses, which sometimes were given in analogy to that practice, especially with canzone, instrumental canzone, which often had a name, so to speak, and a nickname like this. Now, I would like to talk about the fourth category, and that is information about borrowed material or borrowing strategies from pre-existent compositions. Unlike the other, this is nearly exclusive to masses, and very rarely something like a Magnificat. Yes, so with borrowing, I mean borrowing of Gregorian chant in what is often called a paraphrase mass, or of a polyphonic composition in what can be called an imitation or parody mass, for instance. In addition to their purpose of informing about musical borrowing, these title elements can also serve purposes from the categories 1 to 3. So these are, for example, what I call names, as a sort of back formation from Missa sine nomine being a mass without a name and therefore without borrowing. So these would be masses informing about borrowed material. It can also be about title elements informing the composer of a model composition or other information on models. Ignore the fourth one, that's a leftover from a previous slide. It should only be the first three, like so. Yes. For the remaining minutes, I would like to sort of focus now on names. So the information or like a title element such as Ave Maristella or Descendit Angelus, like that are elements that inform about borrowed material that is at the base of such a mass setting. This is just a sort of a general diagram, a stack diagram derived from that database that shows, well, on a side note, or as a first impression, it shows you the remarkable boom period in the like the final quarter and the first third of the then 17th century. That shows numbers of masses, so absolute numbers of masses in printed collection from that period. We see Latin names, sort of, that would be masses referring to a Latin model, or rather to a model that has a Latin name there, were by far the largest group, and then towards the sort of second quarter of the 17th century start becoming more and more rare. Italian models are always much more rare, and then of course we have masses without any kind of indication of borrowing becoming the prevalent standard. This second diagram shows that a bit more. This is in percentages, sort of the percentage of how many prints are published in a year, and we can see that whereas in the mid-16th century we have a strong prevalence of masses with a Latin name, this becomes all practically inexistent by the 1640s. So this is a kind of general, examination or evaluation of what is essentially a compositional development, but as it is represented through prints and as it is represented through the paratexts that are available through these prints. I had various other examples, but I don't think I have time to talk about these now. What I want to say now is that I'm aware that such a strategy of sort of examining stylistic and other musical phenomena through this kind of methodology, that this yields quite general results. In the case of stylistic phenomena, in particular, more detailed analytical studies need to follow a survey like this in order to verify its results and to provide more detail. So, as many of you are probably happy to hear, I do not advocate that we should abandon traditional qualitative hermeneutic methodologies altogether, but I do believe that quantitative methods like that can point us musicologists into new directions. They can visualize general trends, or they can alert us to extraordinary phenomena or other inconsistencies. More importantly, they can adjust historically developed imbalances of historiography. They might relativize the importance of small phenomena, which have experienced a lot of attention in scholarly publications, or they might also help us identify or find access to larger phenomena which have been relatively ignored. I mostly talked about titles of masses here as an example for all sorts of paratext. But I mean in general also that the systematic incorporation of paratext into databases has enormous potential for historiographical and analytical study. Databases such as the series A1 and A2 of RISM have already provided immensely useful resources for the study of early modern music. But the introduction of a work level is particularly exciting because it could involve sort of more systematic incorporation of other forms of paratextual data as well. To interlink and to parse and annotate it could be a challenge that not only provides additional information about musical sources, but also could help defining generic concepts of works in early modern repertories. Thank you very much, so much for now, but I'm of course very happy to have some questions.